Last week, a friend asked me to help her find a research article about voice speech, specifically in women. The article talked about our perceptions of dominance and attractiveness in women, specifically as a function of their voice pitch. And it made me think, is there a correlation between voice pitch or any other attribute or voice or nonverbal communication in general that affects trustworthiness? Or in other words, do we trust people with lower pitch more than higher pitch or anything else in their nonverbal communication? But then I realized that this, just like everything else in trust, is not absolute or universal, but rather relative. And when I think, it gives me ideas for new podcast episodes, and that's what I'm going to share with you today, right after this. Welcome to The Trust Show. I'm Yoram Solomon, your host, the author of the Book of Trust, and facilitator of the Trust Habits Workshop. My mission is simple. I want to help you form habits that build your trustworthiness, because the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? I'm going to start with repeating a few things from my relative trust model, and specifically that we trust people based on who you are and what you do. And the who you are part is based on research that I've done on you. Maybe I checked your profile, LinkedIn, Facebook, or anything else, so or any other source. So I did some research on you. Who you are can be transferable. So what other people tell me about you, and if these are people that I trust and they tell you that they know you and give me certain attributes about you, then I will trust them and it will add to what I know about you. What I know about you helps build the beginning level of trust when we interact. So before we interact, the first time I meet you, the first time I see you, my initial level of trust could not be zero, but rather based on who you are or what I know about you or what was transferred to me about you. Who you are is slow to change. It takes a long time for me to think that you're somebody else. Kind of reminds me of a very famous quote from Maya Angelou that said, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. But, you know, we kind of do believe in that, and we believe in you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and people don't change, and their true colors come out, all those maxims, all those words. So it's very slow to change. My perception of you is slow to change, and it does set the initial level of trust that I have in you when I start interacting with you. But that's not what I'm going to focus on today. What I'm going to focus on today is the what you do. And what you do is what you do during the interaction with me. This cannot rely on any research because I'm not doing research. I'm right there with you in person. It does not rely on anything transferable anymore. I may be validating things that other people told me about you, but it does not rely on that anymore. Now it relies on first-hand impression. It relies on what I hear, what I see, my gut, what my gut tells me. It's a first-hand impression. And it is changing much faster. Every little thing you do builds or destroys the trust that I have in you, or your trustworthiness, in my eyes at least. So it changes much faster. And it affects the level of trust that I have in you at the end of our interaction. So when I leave you, when we part ways, this is what determines the level of trust at the end. So the level of trust at the beginning of our interaction is based on who you are, what I know about you, what people told me about you, research I've done. But the end of our interaction, the level of trust I have in you, relies on what you did during that interaction based on my first-hand impression. Generally, the direction of whether I'm going to trust you more or less during our interaction is determined by the component of positivity. So it's the positivity that you bring into that interaction. And that generally, I categorized into two components: the level of BS or no BS that you bring into the conversation, and the level of empathy that you demonstrate specifically towards me. But I could be affected by empathy that you show towards other people. I remember once driving my younger daughter before she was driving herself with a friend from a social gathering that they participated, and they were sitting both in the back seat, and they were talking and talking and talking, and they're talking about other people in that group. But what they were saying is how great that person is and how we should help that person and so on. And so I was thinking about that. I was feeling more positive about them. I felt that they were more trustworthy in my eyes based on the empathy that they showed, not towards me, but towards other people. But anyway, I digress. So that's not the focus today. So the general direction of trust or distrust as a result of the interaction is basically driven by the positivity of what you bring into that interaction. But it is accelerated by time and intimacy. Let me talk about that. First of all, I have to say that when I say it's accelerated, it can be accelerated in both directions. Spending more time with you or with something accelerates that positivity. So, take, for example, one of the most common examples that I use in my workshops is, do you trust a self-driving car to drive you when you're sitting in the back and nobody's sitting in the front? And my answer is it takes time, but it's not just that it takes time. It takes time, a long time filled with positive experiences. So this car drives well, this car avoids accidents, this car doesn't run over anyone, doesn't hurt me, really allows me to sit down and read. Well, I can't read while driving, while moving. I have motion sickness. But it allows me to do other things and relax instead of me driving. And over time, when it does that enough times, I'm going to trust it. So it accelerates the trust that I have in me as opposed to just knowing the statistics. Okay, but it would accelerate distrust as well. If a person behaves in an untrustworthy way, spending more time with them will accelerate the distrust that I have with them. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that when I want to talk about first impressions. Actually, I'll talk about first impressions right now. So the first time we interact with a person, before they even start bringing in their positivity or negativity into the interaction, we make assumptions. And the assumptions are based on first impressions. And the first impressions could be things that are misleading. When we look at the rule of averages, compared to the average, if this person is X, then we start making assumptions about them. Over time, we make less assumptions and we have more knowledge, real fact. And, one of the examples that I give for first impressions and assumptions is that when I decided to remodel our pool, I invited 3 different companies. I've done my research, so I've done the who you are part. But then as they walked in, 3 of them came with 3 different cars. One of them came up with a beat up old Toyota. I think it was a Corolla. It was rusted. It was beat up. It was old, obviously. The second one came with a Ford F-150. It looked like a 3, 4, 5-year-old Ford F-150. Good shape, taken care of. Very practical for that job. And the third one came with a looked brand new Maserati, a sports car. Obviously not very practical for their business, but obviously they're not carrying stuff in the Maserati. And it dawned on me that I was making assumptions about them, about the quality of work that had absolutely nothing to do with their actual quality of work and who they really are, but only based on my first impression of the cars that they drove. By the way, I do that a lot in my workshops, and I ask people, who would you hire? And almost everybody says the person with the Ford F-150. And when I ask them, why not the person with the Toyota, the beat up old, it's not the fact that it's a Toyota as much as it is a beat up old, rusted Toyota. So why not this person? And they say, well, they're probably not very successful because they're probably not making a lot of money because this is what they buy. Well, there could be other reasons, other explanations, but that's the first explanation that comes to mind. And why not the person with the Maserati? I mean, obviously they're making a lot of money, so they must be very successful. And the answer is typically that, well, they're probably cutting corners, underpaying their employees, using cheap materials, and just so that they can collect, they can get more money for themselves. And look at all, and there could be completely other reasons why that person is driving a Maserati, including that it's not their car and they're borrowing it from a friend. But we don't even make that assumption. We assume who they are based on that first impression. Okay, the reason we need those first impressions, or not the reason we need the first impressions, but the reason we turn those first impressions into assumptions is because our brain, to feel safe, needs a certain amount of information, especially when it comes to other people. Because, and this goes back to very early ages, very early times in history, where we needed to know if the person coming here is going to kill me or trying to kill me or not, and I don't have a lot of time to make that decision. So first impression translates into assumptions because I need a certain amount of information, specifically, are they coming to kill me or not? So we need a certain amount of information to feel safe, or that we're confident and we know what we're facing. And if we don't have that level of information in the form of facts, then we are basing it on assumptions based on first impressions. So time accelerates either trust or distrust, and it accelerates the positivity of the other person's, what the other person brings into the interaction. It accelerates that positivity into trust or negativity into distrust. So that's why time is important. I'll get back to that when I talk about intimacy. When I say intimacy, there are many ways to interpret the word intimacy, but really what I talk about is how much do we get exposed to the overall behavior of the other person. The lowest level of intimacy is when we're only exposed to their writing, their words, their text messages, their emails. We are building in our head, we're building an image of that person and their character and other attributes that they might have based on those words. But we have to keep in mind that those words actually represent only a very small part of their personality. But the other thing is, always keep in mind that you can edit messages. Heck, you can use AI. Well, you can use AI for tone of voice and body language as well, but that's besides the point. But do you really get enough information about them from their words only? So the more intimate we are with them, and again, the way I refer to the word intimacy here is, do we get to hear them, not only get their words, but actually hear how they say those words? Do we get to see their facial expressions and maybe their overall body language? So the more of that we get exposed to, the more we accelerate and decelerate trust, or accelerate trust or accelerate distrust. Now, there are two ways in which this gets affected. Albert Mehrabian is very famous for his 738-55 rule, and that's one of the most misquoted rules, and I use air quotes for rule because it came out in his book Silent Messages in 1971 based on research he has done in 1968 and 69, where he was trying to see how words and tone of voice, and how tone of voice and body language, when they interact with one another, how they affect, and that's what's important because his research was about how it affects liking and feeling about the other person as opposed to understanding them, which is typically how people misquote it. But he, kind of between you and I looked at his original research. I don't know that I would have reached those numbers based on the research he has done. But let's just agree on one thing, and that is that getting exposed to another person's tone of voice and body language does accelerate trust or distrust. And I'm going to give a quote from his book. It's actually a quote from the introduction to the book. The pages that still have Roman numbers as page numbers, and before he starts counting the actual pages. He said this: "When our words contradict the silent messages contained within them, others mistrust what we say." So one way where intimacy accelerates the positivity you bring or negativity you bring into the interaction is in confirming the consistency between what you say and how you say it. Okay, your words and your nonverbal communications. So if they are consistent, it will accelerate trust or distrust. So if you say something negative and your body language says the same thing, then it accelerates my distrust in you. If you say something positive and your body language or your nonverbal communication is consistent with that thing positively, then it accelerates the trust that I have in you. When it is inconsistent, it accelerates distrust. Well, I would say generally, because if you say something positive, but your body says the opposite, your tone of voice, your nonverbal communication says the opposite, I'm going to distrust you because you don't say what you really mean. And I'm getting what you mean more from your nonverbals than from your words. But what happens if you say something negative, but your body reflects positivity? So I would guess it really is context dependent. I would guess that typically you would look at it as, you're making a joke. You're saying something negative, but you really mean positive. So maybe you're being sarcastic. So, does it accelerate trust? Actually, there was research that was done, I believe, in Harvard University that said that sarcasm increases creativity, but we're talking about trust. So let me summarize where we are until now, and that is that our time and intimacy, the more we are exposed to the other person, both in time and in different means of listening to him, perceiving them, the faster we accelerate the trust that we have in them or the distrust that we have in them. So let's leave it at that and move on. Well, this was probably the longest introduction ever in a pod. Well, it's not really the introduction. I needed to bring you into where I'm thinking and how important is the interpretation of body language. And now I'm going to talk about the problem that I started thinking about ever since my friend Rebecca asked me for that article about the correlation between the voice speech and, again, here it wasn't really about trust, but I got to think about trust. So the problem is this. The problem is, remember, when we don't know somebody and we meet them for the first time or at the beginning of an interaction, at the beginning of the first interaction, We haven't spent enough time, so we're basing it on first impressions, and our first impression gives us assumptions. So what do we think about their body language, about their nonverbal communications? I remember in one of the companies that I worked, I was a general manager, and there was someone parallel to me. He was a general manager of another business unit, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he always had. I remember since I met him the first time, he had this expression on his face that I can't describe in any other words than smug or condescending. I mean, he looks at me and he has this smug look. It's like, I know everything, you know nothing. It was this condescending expression, and it immediately affected how I felt about him. Here's the thing. Over time, spending a lot of time with him, I realized that was his freaking face. This is what he looks like. It's terrible that your natural expression is an expression that causes people to think about you the wrong way. But it also made me think. When I don't know another person, the first time we meet, my interpretation of their body language, their voice, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, their overall body expression, all their nonverbals, is based on what we know about other people, what our experience is. When I thought about this guy, and I looked at him and I thought of him as smug or condescending, it was because on average, when I saw people with this expression on their face, it was the reflection of them being smug or condescending. So I compared him to the average, to my experience. You know, I remember once looking at, it was pretty old FBI document that told you how to detect lies. And, you know, I'm going to defer to my friend Melinda Marcus, who's an expert on interpreting body language. But she would tell you, I think, that there is no one right way. There is no, this is how you detect a lie. You know, I remember once reading that if somebody looks up, when you ask them a question and they answer, but they look up and to the left, I think it's the left, either the left or the right, let's say it's the left, it means that they are connecting with the creative part of their brain, and therefore what they're saying is stuff that they're making up on the spot. So they need to be more creative to make up stuff as opposed to recall from memory and give me a real answer to what I asked. I remember once learning that touching your nose is a sign of somebody lying to you. And you know, they're either sweating or whatever. But remember one thing, different people are different. My coworker, my colleague, I have interpreted his expression as smug and condescending because I was looking at this general formula of the overall population. But we are actually a lot more sensitive than that. We can detect very small variations. And they already give us gut feelings about, now he's lying. He wasn't lying before. But in order for us to be able to do that, we have to build a baseline of that specific person's behavior and then compare their current behavior, their current body language, their current nonverbals to that baseline and not to the average. That's a lot more accurate. I remember once I asked the question, how big is the difference between a full-sized SUV and a mid-sized SUV or even a compact SUV? And you'd be surprised in percentages how small that percentage is. But to us, it looks big because we are looking at things in a very relative manner, which is one of the foundations for my whole unique perspective on trust. The trust is relative. Let's, I'm going to throw numbers. Let's say that for a certain expression, facial expression, for example, or tone of voice or whatever, let's say facial expression, the average of the population is a 6. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 6. That's the average. I'm meeting someone, that person shows that expression at 5. And let's say that 1 is negative, the most negative, 10 is the most positive, average is 6, and I see a person with a 5. The first time I see them, I compare them to what I know about this expression from other people, like universal, absolute. So they're 5, and therefore I interpret them as negative. That's why I interpreted my colleague's expression as smug and condescending, because I didn't know him yet. It was relative to other people that I do know. Over time, we may realize that that person, on average, without any special facial expressions, nonverbals, is a 4. Even though the population average is 6, that person is a 4. And therefore, whenever you see 5 on their face, that's a positive sign. But for that, you have to know them. And again, why is it that we jump into interpretation based on what we know about other people, about the average? Because the first time we meet them, we need more information. We don't have that information as facts, like the baseline of their behavior, nonverbal behavior, and expressions and tone of voice. And therefore, we take our first-hand impression, which is compared to the average, and we make assumptions based on that. Okay, takeaways. This is the so what, who cares? So the first thing you have to do is realize that subconsciously, your impression of the other person's nonverbals, body language, tone of voice, facial expressions, that impression does affect whether you trust them or not, and even accelerate the trust or distrust that you have in them. But you have to keep in mind that the first time you meet them, you don't really get the subtleties of this person's behavior and nonverbals, because you don't have a baseline for them. So the first step, I often quote this opening line, or one of the lines from the pilot to one of the best TV shows, the newsroom, where they said that the first step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one, or that you have one. So start by recognizing the fact that when you meet a person, your interpretation of their body language is based on other people and not on this specific person. So start by being aware. Number 2, now that you are aware, do not rely on your interpretation of nonverbal communications and the consistency of that nonverbal with what they're saying. Just don't rely on it. Don't allow yourself to take that first impression of their nonverbals that is based on other people and not them, cause you to make assumptions on who they are and what they're doing and whether you should trust them or not. Do not compare to the average. So when you first meet someone, if you're not sure about what they're saying or whether you can trust them or not, just ask more questions, rely more on the actual words that they're using initially. But then over time, make sure that you do establish a baseline for their nonverbals. And remember that their baseline is not what everybody else's is. And only once you have established a baseline of their nonverbals, and when they are consistent or inconsistent with the words that they're using, their nonverbals and their words, only then you know that your assessment of that consistency or inconsistency is reliable enough to accelerate the trust or distrust that you have in them. That's it for today. I hope that this was not too philosophical for you, because it's actually very actionable, and it's important that you recognize that, first of all, the impact that the consistency of body language or nonverbals, because it includes tone of voice, facial expression, and everything else, the consistency of nonverbals and words does affect the trust that you may have in other people, or the acceleration of that trust or distrust. And it's important that you realize that initially, your interpretation, that unfortunately is typically done by your gut, by your subconscious, and not consciously, that it is initially based not on that specific person, but on other people. And you should try to avoid making that determination early on until you have established a baseline, and only after you've known that person for long enough that you can feel that you can rely on your interpretation of the consistency between their nonverbals and their verbal communication. I hope this made you think a little differently about trust. May trust be with you. This was The Trust Show. What would you like to know about trust and trustworthiness? Let me know and I'll answer it in a future episode. I would love to hear from you. Email me at yoram@thetrustshow.com. If you like this episode, subscribe to the show so you will automatically get notified when I release a new episode. Rate it. Write a review for this podcast, because those ratings help not only you, but also others looking for podcasts just like this. If you're looking for more resources to learn about how to build trust, be trusted, or know who to trust, look up my workshops, online courses, books, or go to my website, trusthabits.com. And remember that the answer to these two questions will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you, and can you trust me? Thank you for listening or watching The Trust Show.